So when I went to your dinner, I didn't know that much about the topic. And so I was wondering how you would present it to someone who's quite new to knowing about trafficking.
Yeah, I usually just share my personal experiences as a journalist, and that I talk about my entry point, and that was meeting Kim Sun-duk. She was 83, a South Korean woman who was enslaved and forced into Japanese military prostitution uh, during the war, actually before and during World War II. And my meeting with her was very powerful. It was a watershed in my life, and it changed my life. Basically, it changed the trajectory of my life and my career. And I began to dedicate myself to researching more and interviewing the survivors of Japanese military sex slavery. And the reason why is because there were around 200,000 to 400,000 of these girls and women all over the Asia Pacific. So there were Chinese, Korean women, Dutch, Papua New Guinea, Malaysian, Singaporean, I mean, you name it, all over the Asia Pacific. And even in mainland China, there were over 1,000 of these military comfort stations where girls and women were raped by up to 50, 60 Japanese soldiers a day in what looked like an outdoor toilet stall, except these girls were on a flimsy bed. And there were lineups, some survivors talked about, that were so long, of these Japanese men with their pants down. And it's the unspeakable. And so Kim Sun-duk, when I met her in Washington, D.C., she was calling on the US government to give a sincere healing apology to survivors and their families of Japanese war crimes and Japanese military sex slavery. And the Japanese government hadn't given an apology that satisfied the survivors and their family. And so I talk about the historical, what happened in history. And just about every Asian person in the Asia Pacific knows about this form of wartime slavery by the Japanese military. And interestingly, when I talk about modern slavery first, some of them may not understand. But then when I say, yeah, you know, the comfort women, the Japanese military sex slavery victims, they're like, ding, 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 this light bulb goes up. And they get it. They get it. And so these two issues are so intertwined, because what happened in history with the wartime sex slavery system sanctioned and implemented by the Japanese government and the Japanese military is repeating itself in the modern day comfort women, the modern day sex trafficking that I've witnessed. And I was very shocked by the similarities when I was interviewing this survivor of bride trafficking. She was a teenager. She was 14 when her elderly husband, she was sold to this elderly farmer in the countryside by her friend's auntie. And he chained her up like a dog, just like the woman in Suzhou, who was chained and is the mother of 8 and is mentally ill and was in freezing temperatures. And this survivor I interviewed, Mei Li, she told me that she was deceived, she was tricked, she was forced. And I was thinking, this is just like the Japanese wartime sex slaves, known by the terrible euphemism comfort women, because their sole role was to comfort the Japanese soldiers. And it just broke my heart that, wow, the same tactics of deception, coercion, of even racial discrimination, because the Japanese military viewed Korean and Chinese women and other darker skinned women as inferior. And even today, when Vietnamese women or North Korean women are trafficked into, mainland China and other countries, they're viewed as lesser than, right? And in a when I was walking in a red light district in Hong Kong, and I saw this sign that had a breakdown of the prices of women that you can buy for sex. And at the top, the most expensive were the Russian women. It literally said Russian, and it was the highest, then Chinese, then it was Thai, then it was African. And it is such an egregious thing. Just the worst of humanity, like sexual exploitation, abuse, racial discrimination, all, mixed up together. And so I sometimes will say this, that sex trafficking is domestic violence on crack cocaine.
Mm.
That it's just the worst form of domestic violence.
Yeah.
And if people can understand, but most people immediately get it, immediately understand that it's so repugnant. Mm. And how could this be? We had transatlantic slavery, many years ago, and people thought it was abolished, right? And but it's still, this ancient form of slavery still exists in our modern day and age.
Yeah. I think one of the chapters in your book is like solely on Hong Kong, and how people living in Hong Kong right now may not understand that when we go to places like Wan Chai, a lot of the women that are there are not there at their own will. And then I've heard about things like, like the Super Bowl is apparently one of the biggest meetups, I guess, for trafficking to happen, or for people who are trafficked to be there and be exploited, and how most major cities have prostitution that is like just below the surface of what people see. And I think something that's really beautiful about your book too is addressing and acknowledging the evil, but also how God still loves every person. And so as humans, as Christians, we are not to, look down upon another, but to try and see them with God's eyes, even if they are pimps, even if they are traffickers, especially if they are victims. And sometimes it can be easier to ignore because it's uncomfortable. Maybe it hits too close to home, or for whatever reason. And so just as like modern women who, like we all choose how to spend our time, like, do you have suggestions on how we can, whether it's this area or another area, how can we go to God and ask him to, just really lead us in not shying away when we see evil, but actively praying and interceding for the evil that we see?
Yeah, no, I liked what you said about seeing even the pimps and the perpetrators and the former Japanese soldiers who raped and used military sex slaves during the war, World War II. I wanted to write about hope, so that it wasn't just this bleak, dark book of stories, but I couch it all in hope, with joy, and but prayer can move mountains. Mm-hmm. And that's my core belief, that's my core value. And I will always pray. I will always pray for everything and for people. And I just want to recommend that for those who don't know how to pray, read an article. You can Google articles on sex trafficking, and you can pray for rescue. Pray for the girls to get hope. Pray for them as if it was your own sister or your own mother, your daughter. And when we have that heart, because God loves each of us with this everlasting, unconditional love. And when we get his heart, then we can pray. Then we can pray and with love, and see a difference made. So I think that's key. So my husband, Matt Friedman, has often asked, what if it was, if it was your daughter, if it was your sister, if it was your mom, you would do everything in your power to help and rescue that person. And so I believe that we cannot view these victims and these survivors as someone out there, a statistic. Um, we have to see them as someone who's loved by God. They're made in God's image. All of us are. And so I just urge people to pray. And even if you don't know how to pray, pray for them as if you know them or they're your family member, and that will shift things in how we intercede for them.
Yeah. And when you were speaking, it reminded me of, God also can speak to us through our thoughts. And sometimes before I pray, I'll ask God to like anoint my thoughts, like show me how you want me to pray. And then earlier we were speaking, I don't know if it was in this interview or before, but how like we get to do with God, like ultimately whatever evil, it's not our responsibility. God's already, Jesus already paid, he's already run the war, but we get to do with him and learn with him and be guided by him. And that's like such a beautiful way to live life in all respects. And
Absolutely.
yeah, so I wonder if you could close us in prayer. If you could, yeah, just pray as you feel led, and just, yeah, bless us with the ability to surrender more to God. And
Yeah. Well, I will definitely pray for a movement of women, an Esther movement, which I really believe is bubbling up in Hong Kong, in mainland China, in other parts of Asia. I'm hearing of women who are really stirred up and rising up to stand for these victims and survivors of sex trafficking. And so I really foresee a real mighty women's movement in this part of the world, and I think it's time. And so I will say a prayer for that. And thank you so much, Jenny, for your thoughtfulness, your wisdom, and your sweetness as we spoke today. It was such an enjoyable experience.
thank
And
you.
so I just want to, and I'll just pray with my eyes open.
Yeah.
I just want to say a prayer for you, that you would take what you've heard today. And if this is something that is stirring in your heart and is part of the purpose that God has for your life, I pray that you will be connected with all the right people, all the right resources, and that you would deeply consider doing the work of justice missions. And that's the Great Commission. And I pray for you that you will be deeply encouraged, that you would grow, that you would be plugged in to an accountability group or a home group at your church, and that you would walk in humility and love. And so, yeah, in Jesus' name I pray. And that's what my book is all about. It's a book of love and compassion and hope. And it was a love letter to all the people I met, all the survivors of sex trafficking and the unspeakable Japanese military sex slavery during the war, and to the frontline workers, and many of them were missionaries who were doing amazing things beyond their human ability. But they all said that it was God who worked through them. So thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Sylvia.